The first thing my brother said after the notary finished reading the will was, "Well, I guess it all worked out the way it should." He said it with a small, satisfied smile, the kind that takes years of practice to make look casual. We were sitting in a law office on King Street in downtown Toronto, the same city where my grandmother had built everything she owned from nothing, starting with a single rented commercial kitchen and a lot of nerve. Outside the window, November rain was pressing against the glass. My brother's wife, Karen, was already reaching across the table to squeeze his hand, and I was sitting there in my paramedic uniform I had driven straight from a 12-hour shift because no one thought to tell me the meeting had been moved up a day, holding a cold cup of coffee like I needed something to grip. Then my brother looked at me across the table and said, "We'll need you out of the cottage by the end of the month. We have plans for the spring." My sister-in-law nodded. "It's nothing personal, Claire. It's just that it's ours now." I didn't answer. I couldn't find the words, and even if I had, I'm not sure my voice would have cooperated. 3 days earlier, I had stood at a gravesite in the Muskokas and watched them lower my grandmother into the ground. Her name was Margaret Eleanor Calloway, but everyone who loved her called her Nana, and she had been the most deliberate person I had ever known. She started her first bakery at 32, with money she saved working double shifts as a hospital dietary aide. By the time she was 50, she had 3 locations in the GTA. By 60, she had sold the business for enough to retire to the lake property she had dreamed about since childhood, a white clapboard cottage on a quiet arm of Lake Muskoka with a cedar dock, a screened porch, and a view that changed color with every season. She was 81 when she died, and until her last winter, she still got up before the sun. She was not a sentimental woman in the way people usually mean. She didn't cry at movies or keep every birthday card, but she showed up. That was her version of love, consistent, unglamorous, and reliable. When I was 9 and my parents split up and my brother went to live with my father in Calgary, Nana drove down from the lake every second weekend and sat with me at the kitchen table while I did homework. When I got into paramedic college and everyone else in the family thought I should do something more practical, she handed me a check for the first semester's tuition and said, "People who run toward the trouble are the ones worth investing in." I spent every summer at the cottage from the time I could walk. I learned to paddle a canoe there. I learned to bake bread there. I learned that the best conversations happen on a dock at dusk, when the loons are calling and there's nowhere else to be. During my hardest years as a paramedic, the calls that stay with you, the ones that don't go away, it was Nana's porch I came back to. She never asked me to talk about it. She just made tea and sat across from me until I was ready. My brother David moved to Calgary when we were kids and came back to Ontario 8 years ago with Karen and a firm handshake and a habit of talking about real estate values in every conversation. He loved Nana. I believe that. But he loved her the way some people love a landmark, admiringly, from a certain distance, without ever really learning its history. When Nana's health started declining last spring, I was the one who drove up on weekends. I was the one who sorted her medications and made sure she had groceries and sat with her in the evenings when the house got quiet and the lake turned silver outside the window. My brother visited twice. Both times he brought wine and stayed one night. Karen spent most of the visit talking about what the property might be worth now that the market had shifted. I'm not telling you this to cast blame. I'm telling you because it matters to understand who we each were before the will was read. The notary, a careful, gray-haired woman named Miss Fontaine, read through the document in a steady, professional voice. My brother received the cottage and the land. He received the investment accounts and the remaining assets from the business sale. He received the car and the contents of the main property. When she reached my name, there was a pause that lasted just long enough to be uncomfortable. Then a brief provision. Some personal items, Nana's cast-iron skillet, her handwritten recipe binders, and a small RRSP that had maybe $18,000 in it. David exhaled slowly, like a man who had been holding his breath without realizing it. Karen straightened in her chair. I sat there and thought about the last thing Nana had said to me that made any real sense. She had been sitting up in bed at the cottage on a Tuesday afternoon in September, the window open and the smell of lake water drifting in. She had taken my hand with both of hers and looked at me with that sharp, clear expression that the illness hadn't touched. "Read the haunted, sweetheart," she said. "Every page. Don't let anyone skip ahead for you." I thought she was talking about life in general, the way she sometimes spoke in the last months, giving out lessons like she was settling accounts. Now, sitting in that office watching my brother accept congratulations from Miss Fontaine while Karen started typing something on her phone, I wasn't so sure. The drive back to the city took 2 hours in the rain. I had nowhere particular to go. I had been staying at the cottage since October, taking a temporary leave from my station to be closer to Nana in her final weeks. My apartment in Hamilton had been sublet to a nursing student for 4 months. I had a duffel bag in the trunk of my car and a toothbrush in the cottage bathroom and a key on my keyring that apparently was no longer mine to use. David texted me the next morning. "End of the month would be fine," he said. "No rush. Just let us know when you're clear." I read the message twice. Then I put my phone face down on the cottage kitchen table and looked out at the dock. The lake was flat and gray, the same color as the sky. A pair of mergansers floated near the far shore. I had eaten breakfast at that table 10,000 times. I had done homework there, cried there, laughed there, sat there in the dark during blackouts with a candle and my grandmother's voice telling stories I never got tired of hearing. End of the month. I was 31 years old, a certified advanced care paramedic with 8 years on the job, and I had just been given 4 weeks' notice to vacate the place that felt more like home than anywhere I had ever lived. That afternoon, I drove into Bracebridge and sat in a diner on Manitoba Street for 2 hours, drinking coffee and trying to figure out what came next. My station chief had already approved my leave extension. My Hamilton apartment was rented through February. I could probably call in a favor and stay with my partner Denise and her husband in Barrie, but the idea of explaining the whole situation was exhausting in a way I couldn't fully articulate. I was on my 3rd coffee when my phone rang. The screen read, Fontaine Bergstrom Notarial Services, Barrie, Ontario. I stared at it for 1 full ring before I answered. "Is this Claire Calloway?" The voice belonged to Miss Fontaine. She sounded composed, the way professionals do when they're delivering information that is anything but. "Yes," I said. "Miss Calloway, I hope I'm not catching you at a difficult moment." She paused. "I have something I need to ask you. Did your brother read the entire estate document? All of it, including the schedule attached at the back?" The question hit me somewhere in the chest. "I assumed he did," I said. There was a brief silence. Then Miss Fontaine said, in a tone that was carefully neutral but not quite emotionless, "That's what I was afraid of." I set down my coffee cup. "I don't understand." "I think it might be better if you came into the office," she said. "There are some details about your grandmother's estate directive that we should go through together. Specifically, the conditional schedule attached to the primary document." "Conditional schedule," I repeated. "Yes." Another pause. "Miss Calloway, your grandmother was a very thorough woman." "I know," I said. I believe she anticipated certain outcomes rather precisely. I looked out the diner window at the gray November street. A woman was walking a golden retriever past the hardware store. Somewhere in the back of my memory, Nana's voice was saying the same 4 words she had said to me in September, "Read the whole document." "How soon can you see me?" I asked. "I can clear some time tomorrow morning," Miss Fontaine said. 9 o'clock. "Do you know where the office is?" I told her I'd find it. The drive to Barrie felt longer than usual, even though it was barely 40 minutes down the 11. I spent most of it with the radio off, replaying Miss Fontaine's voice in my mind. Conditional schedule. The more I turned the phrase over, the more it sounded like something Nana would do. She had run a small business for 3 decades. She understood contracts. She understood clauses and contingencies, and the importance of reading past the line that told you what you wanted to know. She had also understood people. There was a story she used to tell about the early days of the bakery, when a supplier had tried to skim off her wholesale agreement by hiding a substitute clause in the 3rd page of a renewal contract. Everyone had told her to just sign it, not worth the fight. She had read every word anyway, flagged the clause, and negotiated the original terms back. The supplier never tried it again. "Always read to the end," she used to say. "The people who are trying to fool you are counting on the fact that you won't." I parked outside the office at 5 minutes to 9. The building was a low-brick professional unit just off Dunlop Street, the kind of place that had been there for 30 years and never felt the need to update its signage. Inside, it smelled like old paper and central heating. Miss Fontaine met me in the small boardroom. She was already seated when I arrived, a thick file folder open on the table in front of her, a yellow legal pad beside it. She stood to shake my hand and then gestured to the chair across from her. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I know this has been a difficult week." "What is the conditional schedule?" I asked. She nodded, respecting the directness. She turned to a section near the back of the folder and slid several pages toward me. Your grandmother added this as a registered schedule to her will approximately 14 months ago, Miss Fontaine said. It was properly executed and witnessed. It is fully enforceable under Ontario law. I looked at the heading at the top of the first page. Schedule B, Conditions of Inheritance. Miss Fontaine folded her hands. The primary bequest to your brother stands. The cottage, the land, the accounts. All of that is as I read it on Tuesday. She paused. However, the inheritance is conditional upon 3 specific obligations being met. I felt something shift quietly in my chest. What obligations? She began to read. The first condition was that the primary beneficiary must allow Claire Calloway unrestricted residency at the Muskoka property for as long as she wished to remain. The second condition was that Claire Calloway must be consulted and given shared stewardship authority over any significant changes to the property, including sale, renovation, or repurposing. The third condition was that the beneficiary must maintain annual contributions to the Muskoka Food Security Network in Margaret Calloway's name, as outlined in the estate directive. Nana had helped found that organization 15 years ago. It ran a network of community pantries across the district and served hundreds of families every winter. I sat very still. Miss Fontaine turned to the final section of the schedule. And here, she said, placing her finger gently at the top of the last page, is the enforcement clause. I read it myself. In the event that any of the above conditions are violated or materially disregarded by the primary beneficiary, full title to the Muskoka property and all associated assets shall transfer immediately and irrevocably to Claire Margaret Calloway. I looked up slowly. My brother told me to move out by the end of the month, I said. Miss Fontaine's expression was even, but not unkind. Yes, she said. That's why I called. The room was very quiet for a moment. Outside, a delivery truck backed into a loading bay somewhere down the street, its signal beeping steadily. He violated it, I said. Within 48 hours of the reading, she said. Yes. I leaned back in my chair. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel relieved. What I felt was something closer to the particular sadness that comes when something you half suspected turns out to be exactly true. She knew, I said. Miss Fontaine opened a second folder on the table. Your grandmother asked me to prepare the transfer documentation in advance, she said quietly. She told me she suspected it might be needed. She also left something for you. She placed an envelope on the table between us. My name was written on the front in Nana's handwriting, the wide looping cursive she used for everything important, birthday cards and grocery lists and the labels on her jam jars. Claire. Miss Fontaine excused herself to get coffee and left me alone with it. The envelope contained 2 folded pages, handwritten on the cream stationery Nana kept in the drawer beside her bed. I recognized the faint scent of the lavender sachets she kept in that drawer. I read slowly. My dear Claire, if you are reading this letter, then things have gone more or less the way I expected. I want you to know that this was never a trap set in anger. It was a test designed in love. I stopped for a moment. Then I kept reading. Your brother is not a bad man, but comfort makes some people careless, and carelessness has its own kind of cruelty. I have watched him for years, the way I have watched many people, and I learned that what he values most is what comes easily. You have never been that way. You have always run toward the hard thing. I admired that about you from the time you were small. The property was not the point. The property was the measure. If your brother had honored the conditions welcomed you, preserved the place responsibly, supported the work we started with the Food Network, he would have proven himself ready. If he cast you out in the first week, he would prove something else. I had to read that twice. You are probably feeling a mixture of things right now. Some of it will feel like justice. Be careful with that feeling. Justice and revenge wear the same coat, and it is easy to get confused in the dark. You have every right to what is now legally yours. But before you act, I want you to ask yourself one question. Not what do you deserve, but what do you want to be on the other side of this? The answer to that question is more important than any property deed. The cottage is yours if you want it. It has always felt more like yours than anyone else's. But the real thing I'm leaving you isn't wood and water. It's the chance to show yourself what you're made of when the easier path is to be small. Take care of the lake. Take care of the pantry network. And if your brother finds his way to honesty, leave the screen door unlocked. I love you more than you know, I always have. All my heart. Nana. P.S. The cast iron skillet needs to be seasoned before winter. Don't let it sit. I sat with the letter in my hands for a long time. The boardroom window looked out over a gray November parking lot. Somewhere out on the lake, the Mergansers were probably still floating, unhurried, going wherever the current suggested. Miss Fontaine came back with 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of me without a word. After a while, I looked up. "What happens next?" "Once you sign the transfer documents," she said, "I file them with the registry. Title transfers within a few business days. Your brother will be notified formally by registered mail. And then? Then you are the legal owner of the property." She paused. "What you do with that is your decision." I thought about the drive up to the Muskokas that afternoon. I thought about walking through the door and telling my brother what Nana had arranged. I thought about his face, that controlled, managed expression cracking open into something real for the first time in years. Part of me wanted that moment badly. A smaller, quieter part of me wasn't sure what it would actually solve. I signed the documents. 3 days later, I drove back to the lake. The morning I returned, the weather had broken. There had been a hard frost overnight, and the trees along the highway were bare and white-tipped, the sky above them a cold, clean blue. I drove with the window cracked slightly because I needed the air, needed to feel the November bite of it on my face. The lake appeared between the trees about 2 kilometers before the driveway. That first glimpse of water always did something to me, a small physical loosening in my chest, like setting down something I had been carrying without noticing. Even that morning, even with everything that was happening, it happened. I pulled into the driveway. My brother's rental car was still there. He and Karen had extended their stay to deal with what they'd called property logistics. Through the kitchen window, I could see movement, Karen at the counter, her back to the glass. I sat in the car for a moment. Then I took Nana's letter from the passenger seat, folded it carefully, and put it in the inside pocket of my jacket. I knocked on my own front door. David opened it. He was wearing one of Nana's old fleece pullovers, a worn green one she always kept on the hook near the mudroom, and for a second that detail hit me harder than almost anything else. He looked surprised to see me. Then, quickly, careful. "Claire," he said, "I thought you were in Barrie." "I was," I said. "I need to talk to you." He glanced back over his shoulder, then stepped aside to let me in. The cottage smelled exactly the way it always had. Wood smoke and cedar and the faint, persistent sweetness of 40 years of baking. Karen came out of the kitchen drying her hands on a dish towel. Her smile was polite and guarded. "We were just having coffee," she said. "Do you want some?" "Sure," I said. We sat at the kitchen table, the 3 of us, the way we had sat at hundreds of family meals over the years. Outside the window, the dock was empty, and the lake was very still. A crow landed on the nearest birch tree and regarded us with the frank indifference of its kind. I placed the Schedule B documents on the table. David looked at them without touching them. "What is this?" "The part of the will you didn't read," I said. Karen set down her coffee cup. My brother picked up the top page slowly. He read the heading. His face changed in stages, first a small frown, then a careful blankness, then something I hadn't seen on his face in a very long time. "Uncertainty. This is the estate directive," he said. His voice was even but careful. "Schedule B," I said. "The conditional clause." Karen leaned over and read the top paragraph. She looked up at me sharply. "This can't be right." "It was filed with the registry 14 months ago," I said. "Miss Fontaine authenticated it. It's fully registered under Ontario law." David read further. I watched him get to the enforcement clause. I watched him read it twice. "The title has already transferred," I said, before he could ask. "Miss Fontaine filed the documents 3 days ago. You should have received a registered letter." He was quiet for a long moment. Karen started to say something, and he held up one hand, briefly, and she stopped. Finally, he looked at me. "She set this up," he said. "She gave you a choice," I said. "She didn't set up the ending." "You did." He looked back at the document. Outside, the crow shifted on the branch and then lifted off over the water. "I told you to leave," he said. It wasn't a defense. It sounded more like a man identifying where he had taken the wrong turn. "Within 2 days of her funeral," I said. Karen put down her coffee cup and looked at her hands. David was still reading the page, though I suspected he had stopped actually taking in the words. "We just assumed he started." "You assumed I'd go quietly," I said. "She assumed you'd assume that." She knew both of us pretty well. The kitchen was very quiet, the refrigerator hummed. A log shifted in the wood stove. My brother put the document down on the table and looked at me with an expression I hadn't expected. Not anger. Not strategic calculation, something more tired than either. "What are you going to do?" he asked. It was the same question, I realized, that fathers and husbands and siblings have been asking people who suddenly hold all the cards, for as long as there have been estates to inherit and families to inherit them. I thought about Nana writing her letter. I thought about her choosing her words with the same care she used for everything: recipes, contracts, conversations that mattered. She had not told me what to do. She had asked me what I wanted to be on the other side of this. "I'm not throwing you out," I said. Karen looked up. "But things are going to be different," I said. I put the second document on the table. I had drafted it with Miss Fontaine the day before, going through 3 versions until it said exactly what I meant. The cottage would remain in my name. The title would not change. David and Karen could use the property 4 weeks per year, to be agreed upon by calendar in advance, provided, and this was the clause Miss Fontaine had helped me word carefully, that those visits included active participation in the annual fundraising work for the Muskoka Food Security Network. Nana had left the pantry organization a legacy gift in the estate, enough to expand the cold storage and add 2 new distribution points before the following winter. What it needed, more than money, was people willing to show up for the volunteer weeks, the sorting drives, the community dinners. My brother read the document slowly. "You want us to work for it," he said. "I want you to care about something she cared about," I said. "That's not the same thing." Karen looked at the document for a long time. Then she said something that surprised me. "She used to talk about the pantry program when we visited," she said quietly. I never asked her much about it. "I know," I said. There was no sharpness in how I said it, just the truth of it, sitting there on the table between us. My brother folded the papers slowly and set them down. He looked out the window at the lake. "She was always the smartest one in the room," he said. There was no bitterness in it. It sounded like something he had known for a long time, and was only now saying out loud. "Yes," I said. "He didn't sign that day. He asked for a week, and I gave it to him. Miss Fontaine had told me there was no legal rush." I moved back into the cottage that evening, into the room I had slept in every summer since I was 4 years old. The narrow bed with the patchwork quilt, the pine dresser with the sticky top drawer, the window that looked out over the water toward the far shore, where the lights of a few other cottages glimmered on the dark November surface. I found the cast-iron skillet in the lower cabinet and seasoned it before I went to sleep, the way Nana had taught me, with a thin coat of flaxseed oil and an hour in the oven. I don't know why it felt important to do it that night, but it did. The weeks that followed were quiet in the way that follows a loud thing. The pantry organization sent a coordinator named Patrice to meet with me about the legacy gift, and we spent 2 cold afternoons walking the distribution sites and talking about what the expansion could look like. One of the sites was a church hall in Gravenhurst where volunteers sorted donations every Thursday morning. I started going on Thursdays. It felt good to do something concrete. Paramedics understand that better than most people, when things are uncertain, the best response is usually a useful action. My brother signed the agreement 2 weeks later. He drove up from Toronto on a Saturday, without Karen, and we sat at the kitchen table and he signed where Miss Fontaine had marked, and I signed below him. Then we sat there for a while longer without saying much, drinking the coffee I had made in Nana's old percolator. "I don't know how to do this yet," he said. He meant the volunteer work, the pantry drives, the showing up for something that wasn't his idea. "Neither did I 3 months ago," I said. He looked at the percolator. "She always made better coffee than anyone. She always did everything better than anyone." He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. The following spring, a crew came to repair the cedar dock, which had taken some water damage over the winter. I stood on the shore watching them work, and I thought about Nana the way I thought about her constantly in those early months, not as someone I was grieving, but as someone I was still learning from. The letter was in the drawer of the bedside table. I had read it so many times that I could recite most of it from memory. "The real thing I'm leaving you isn't wood and water. It's the chance to show yourself what you're made of when the easier path is to be small." I went back to my station in April. My partner Denise said I seemed different. I asked her how. She thought about it for a minute and then said, "More settled, like you know where you're going." I wasn't sure that was exactly right. What I knew was where I had come from. I knew the table where I had been taught to read, and the dock where I had learned to be patient, and the smell of a kitchen where someone had loved me clearly and consistently for 31 years. I knew the sound of a lake at 5 in the morning when the light is just arriving and the loons are calling from somewhere in the mist, and the whole world is still deciding what kind of day it's going to be. That's not a small thing to know. The pantry expansion opened in November, on the 1-year anniversary of Nana's passing. There was a small ceremony at the main distribution hall in Gravenhurst. Nothing formal, just the volunteers and the board members and a few families who used the service and wanted to mark the occasion. Someone had framed a photograph of Nana from about 15 years ago, standing in the original pantry space with her arms crossed and a completely characteristic expression of confident impatience. Like she was wondering why they hadn't opened sooner. My brother came. Karen came. They wore sensible shoes and sorted boxes for 4 hours without complaining. At the end of the afternoon, David found me near the loading dock. He had a smudge of something on his jacket from the sorting tables, and his hair was disheveled in a way I hadn't seen since we were children. She would have liked this, he said. She would have had opinions about the shelving system, I said. He laughed. A real one. Brief and genuine. We stood there watching the last of the volunteers carry boxes out to the parking lot, and I thought about how long it takes for people to become what circumstances have always been asking them to be. Some people never get there. Some people need to lose something first. I don't know what my brother learned about himself that year. That's his story to tell, not mine. What I know is what I learned. I learned that love that shows up the consistent, unglamorous kind is the kind that actually changes people. I learned that a document is only as honest as the person who wrote it, and that my grandmother had been the most honest person I ever knew. I learned that justice and revenge do wear the same coat, and that the difference between them usually comes down to what you're carrying in your pockets when you reach for it. And I learned that the most valuable thing someone can leave you is not property or money or even memories. It is a clear example of how to be. Something to aim for when the easy road is available, and the right one is harder and longer and asks more of you than you thought you had. On the last night of that November, I sat on the cottage dock with a blanket and a thermos of black coffee, the way Nana had sat on that same dock on 1,000 November nights before me. The lake was still. The far shore was dark. Above the tree line, the stars were out in the particular extravagance they only achieve when the air is cold enough to thin the distance between you and them. I thought about what I wanted to say the next time someone asked me what she left me. Not the cottage. Not the money. Not even the letter, as much as I would always keep it. What she left me was the example of a life built carefully. Built toward something. Built in the understanding that character is not what you have when things are easy, but what you reach for when they aren't. I think about that most mornings when I pull on my uniform and start the truck. I think about it every Thursday when I drive to Gravenhurst. I thought about it that night on the dock, listening to the silence of the lake, holding the thermos in both hands, feeling steadier than I had felt in a long time. Stand steady, she would have said. So I do.